such a notification was sent out?
I would say that I don't think I would have required to see that to know that matters that were relevant to matters of substance, salient, relevant to the inquiry should be retained, and that I had a duty, as all ministers and officials would have had a duty, to ensure that anything that they were exchanging in informal messaging, if they were not retaining those messages in line with the policies that were in place, then there would be a clear record of anything on the Scottish Government systems.
You said on the 24th of August 2021 at a COVID media briefing given by you that the Scottish Government had started the process of setting up the Scottish COVID inquiry, which we mentioned a moment ago. You stated, "I believe that a full public inquiry has a very important role to play, both in scrutinising the decisions we took and indeed continue to take in the course of the pandemic, and also in identifying and learning lessons for the future." Do you agree that in order to scrutinise decisions and learn lessons, a public inquiry would need to see not just the decisions themselves, but the discussions that led to the decisions being made or not made, including discussion of information and advice?
Yes, I do agree with that. And what I would add to that, and let me say this is obviously a matter for the inquiry to judge, in terms of any informal communications I had, which, as I have already said, were limited, both in terms of the number of people and the extent of the communication. There would be nothing in those communications that was not available to either the inquiry or the public through the record of the Scottish Government, or indeed in the very detailed public statements that were being made every day. I want to assure the inquiry of that I take and took very seriously the duty that was on the shoulders of me as First Minister and of the Scottish Government collectively to make sure that this inquiry and the corresponding Scottish inquiry would have at its disposal all of the evidence and material that would allow it to assess the decisions and the underpinning reasoning and evidence for those decisions. Over the course of the pandemic, and forgive me if I'm getting ahead of your line of questioning, we will no doubt talk about Cabinet papers and minutes. Over the course of the pandemic, I think there would have been in the region of 100 Cabinet meetings. For each of those, there would be detailed papers, detailed minutes that would not just record the decisions that Cabinet reached, but that would look at the different options we assessed and discussed, that would narrate the evidence and the reasoning behind the decisions we arrived at. And in Cabinet minutes would also have lengthy and comprehensive summaries of the points made in the discussion around the Cabinet table. Now, obviously that is not all that the inquiry has at its disposal, but if it was all that this inquiry had, that would be a comprehensive and very detailed account of every decision that the Scottish Government took in the course of the pandemic.
As at May, at least, I think you've indicated already, you were fully cognizant of the fact that there would be a public inquiry, yes?
Yes.
And in August 2021, you announced that there would be one.
Yes.
You knew at the time when you made the statement announcing the Scottish COVID inquiry that material which you had used to exchange messages, informal communications, would assist in the very important aims of the inquiry, scrutinising the decisions that you took.
Yes.
And you knew at that point that those messages had been destroyed.
I knew, yes, that I had operated in line with a policy that I had operated in line with, and advice that I had from the outset of my time as a minister to ensure that conversations with others in government with any impact or relationship to government business shouldn't be kept on a phone that could be lost or stolen, but properly recorded. And I was very cognizant of, and had been from the start of the pandemic, so not just at the points in time that you are referring to, from the start of the pandemic, of my duty to ensure that anything of salience, relevance, substance to the decision-making of the government would be properly recorded through the Scottish Government record.
Thank you. You were asked a question by a journalist from Channel 4 where he asked you at that very press conference in August 2021, Scottish Government has a patchy record of disclosing evidence when asked to do so. Can you guarantee to the bereaved families that you will disclose emails, WhatsApps, private emails, if you've been using them, whatever, that nothing will be off limits to the inquiry? You responded, I think if you understand statutory public inquiries, you would know that even if I wasn't prepared to give that assurance, which for the avoidance of doubt I am, then I wouldn't have the ability. He asked specific questions about informal means of communication, including WhatsApps, but you knew by that stage that your WhatsApps had been destroyed.
But I also knew that anything of any relevance or substance from any of that material would be properly recorded in the Scottish Government system, and indeed would have been communicated in all likelihood by me through the daily media briefings that I gave. The importance in my view, is making sure that the inquiry has at its disposal all of the evidence underpinning the decisions as well as the decisions we were arriving at. I operated from 2007 based on advice, the policy that messages, business relating to government should not be kept on a phone that could be lost or stolen and insecure in that way, but properly recorded through the system. I would want to, again, underline that in my case, that communication was extremely limited, and I do not, would not relate to matters of substantive government decision-making.
But that wasn't the question you were asked. You were asked the question as to whether you would disclose emails, WhatsApps, private emails, have been using them, whatever. He didn't ask you the question as to whether the material that was contained within the discussions exchanged by those media was recorded on the corporate record. He asked whether the emails, WhatsApps, private emails, whatever would be disclosed, and you gave an assurance that they would be.
And I, as will have been the case in many occasions over the course of not just the COVID pandemic, but in my many years in politics, answering questions, when you're answering questions, you're trying to answer the substance of the question, and when you look back at the literal terms of the answer, it can be put to you in that way. So I accept that, and I apologise if that answer was not as clear. But I also want to be very clear and give the inquiry a personal assurance that I am certain that the inquiry has at its disposal anything and everything germane to my decision-making during the process and the time period of the pandemic, and the factors underpinning those decisions. That has always been important to me, and it remains important to me, but more importantly than that, it's essential to the scrutiny of the decisions that I will carry the impact of these decisions with me forever, and I want to make sure that those who come after me in politics have the benefit of the learning, the things that my government did right and the things that my government did not, that were not right, or with hindsight that we wish we had done differently. I cannot say strongly enough how important that is to me. These decisions were of a magnitude beyond what I had ever experienced, and that is true of decision makers everywhere, and the impact of them I think about literally every day, and I want this inquiry and the Scottish inquiry to scrutinise those decisions so that we can learn and future governments can learn appropriate lessons from them.
In case there's any doubt on the matter, Ms Sturgeon, when I delivered the opening statement in this module, we were keen to try to make it clear that our position with regard to those decisions was that they were extremely difficult decisions, and I think there can be no doubt about that. As regards your production of documents, however, you did not produce to us any WhatsApps, messages or any other informal communications with your first statement dated the 6th of November 2023, despite the request that you do so.
At the time, for the reasons I have set out, I did not hold WhatsApp messages or text messages at that point, and as I have said, because I had gone through a process of making sure anything of relevance, which would have been very, very limited, I could assure myself would be available through the public record and the Scottish Government record. When I was asked to double check when the inquiry sent another request for a statement, I discovered a isolated text message with one individual, the then Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, which I provided to the inquiry. And I also found, and I apologise to the inquiry because I hadn't at the time thought to look in this place because it would not be a normal means of communication. But when I was racking my brains to see where I could find anything that might be relevant, I looked at the DM function of Twitter and found there some messages with Professor David Schridder and also some very limited messages with Professor Jason Leach, which I then provided to the inquiry. I also sought and was provided through the government with messages between me and Liz Lloyd and Humza Yousaf, which I was aware the inquiry would have from them, but nevertheless, because I then held them, passed them to the inquiry. There is one exchange in the Twitter DM messages with Jason Leach that I think gives an indication of my approach to informal messaging, where he is raising something with me, and I think it is the last message in this exchange. I in terms say to him, if you want to talk about matters like this, come and see me properly. This is not the place to do it. And that was my attitude to that kind of messaging.
So should we take that to be an instruction to Professor Leach that if he wanted to carry out such conversations where he was discussing important matters related to the pandemic with you, you wanted to be clear to him that that was a matter which was not appropriate for these media? It should be done more formally, in-person discussions was your practice?
Absolutely, and that was, I made it clear to him that that was my practice. I think the exchange was related to hospital capacity and ventilation facilities in hospitals at a relatively early stage of the pandemic.
Yes. Of course, Professor Leach, we know, conducted extensive discussions related to important decisions in the pandemic with others, including the current First Minister. As
I know you will appreciate, I have only seen exchanges that have been explored at previous evidence sessions, so I cannot talk in any way about the totality of those messages. Yes. I have not seen, to the best of my knowledge, anything that would suggest he was engaging in decision-making. There are exchanges, conversational exchanges. Many of these exchanges that I have seen, and from other governments as well, I think on WhatsApp would be the kind of exchange that had people not been working remotely and been in the same building as I actually was with key advisors throughout the pandemic. These are the kind of conversations that would have happened verbally, face to face, and end up being translated to WhatsApp because of the nature of people's working environments.
Given the fact that you were in St Andrew's House, I think, quite a lot of the time, as we heard from Ms Freeman, as she was, there were a large number of those verbal conversations between you and others, like Ms Freeman, who are based predominantly there during the pandemic. Isn't that right?
Yes. I mean, the majority of the conversations that I would be having with certainly Ms Freeman and the Chief Medical Officer at the time and other senior advisors would be face-to-face in St Andrew's House. I was in St Andrew's House from very early in the morning till very late at night, almost every day for an extended period of time, as were these other individuals.
I think Ms Freeman did say 7 days a week you're all there.
For a period, 7 days a week, yes.
Yes. Were the salient points of those verbal discussions committed to the corporate record?
Yeah, so at my private office were also, not my entire private office, but key individuals in my private office, and they would have a rota. There would be somebody from my private office in the building with me. So salient points would be recorded as appropriate and fed through the system. I think perhaps, if I may, there's two further points to be made there. If I, as First Minister, am having a discussion with anybody that then requires action to be taken, if that's not inputted to the system, action won't be taken. That is how conversations turn into actions that are necessary. The second point is just to reflect, particularly in the very early stages of the pandemic and in the early stages of, well, certainly through March and into April 2020, there was a frenetic pace of decision making, and we were taking decisions at very short notice. The situation was changing several times a day, and we were all working at pace. I would have conversations in the morning that by the afternoon the situation had changed, and so the nature of those conversations would be different. And I think it's 3-4 years on, it is difficult sometimes to appreciate just how frenetic the pace of activity was at that time.
The fact that you're working at pace, though, doesn't alter the obligation to make sure that salient points of conversations and messaging are on the corporate record.
Oh no, absolutely. But for example, I remember on the 23rd of March 2020, the day that we entered what became known as lockdown, having conversations because the advice that was coming at that point was that we required very strict measures to suppress the virus at that stage. The measures that had been introduced previously weren't bringing the R number down sufficiently. I remember having conversations with Ms Freeman, the Chief Medical Officer at the time. We then, of course, went into COBRA, and those decisions were formalised through the COBRA meeting, and they'd be recorded that way. So I suppose what I'm saying is the ways in which these conversations would become decisions and then be recorded was perhaps different in the environment we were in at that point than would be the case in normal times and normal government business.
Whereas with these verbal conversations, it wouldn't be possible for us to work out whether the salient points of those had been transcribed to the corporate record, because although we might have the corporate record, we don't know what the conversations were. In contradistinction, we do now have some messages, so we could compare the corporate record to those messages and work out for ourselves whether the salient points had been transcribed.
I am absolutely sure that you would be able to take messages and go to the corporate record, go to the public statements that were made at the time and see all of that reflected. It may not be the case that in every instance you will see, conversation between on this date and the reference on the corporate record tying those up, absolutely. But I am absolutely certain that the salient points that we were discussing then would be reflected on the corporate and indeed on the public record. These were, by their very nature, these were decisions that could not be kept secret, even if we had wanted to, which we didn't, because these were decisions that were asking the public to do things, or more regularly not to do things, that had to be communicated. They were also decisions that had very significant impacts for the private sector, for the public sector, for society as a whole. They had to be recorded in a way that they could be actioned and communicated clearly, quickly and effectively.
That may apply to the decisions themselves, that they couldn't be kept secret because also ultimately the public found out about them, the restrictions and everything. However, the discussions relating to the decisions and how they had been reached could, it would appear, be kept secret.
Well, I would like to give an assurance to the inquiry that contrary to there being any desire on the part of me or my government to keep things secret, I would suggest that the opposite was the case during the pandemic. We went to great lengths to communicate not just the decisions. I took a view very early on in the pandemic, it's for others to judge whether it was right or wrong, that if we were to achieve a level of compliance with the restrictions that we were placing the country under, then it was important that the public didn't just know what we were asking them to do, but why we were asking them to do it. and what the reasoning was that had taken us to those decisions. And that's what I sought to do, sometimes effectively, perhaps sometimes not so effectively, on a daily basis. So we were not having discussions that weren't then being communicated to the public openly. In the nature of not just government, but life generally, it is not possible to record, and I'm not even sure it's desirable to good governance, if I may say that, to record every single word that is uttered in a conversation in government. There needs to be, in government, and I think this is in the interest of good governance, the ability for ministers with each other or ministers with advisers to have an open, thinking out loud discussion before getting to the point of a proposal, let alone a decision. But salient points about why we were taking decisions and what those decisions were, absolutely. To go back to, I think, the question you initially put to me, Mr Dawson, absolutely. I firmly am of the view that they will all be discernible from the corporate government record and, indeed, over and above that, the public record.
We subsequently learned from your second statement that you had used various informal means of communication for some messaging with Mr Youssef, Ms Lloyd, Mr Swinney, Ms Freeman, Dr Calderwood, Dr Smith, Professor Leach, Ken Thompson, Leslie Evans, Professor Sridhar, the First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford, and the former Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, Michelle O'Neill. Is that correct?
Yes.
You produced no messages with any of these individuals with your first statement. Is that correct? Yes,
but as I also say in the statement, those messages would have been extremely limited. If I take John Swinney, for example, it has never been our practice, not just during the pandemic, but generally to text. I don't think I've ever WhatsApped John Swinney, and certainly if I have, it would be the exception. But text messages would be very occasional, and the nature of the text messages that I would have with John Swinney would be, are you free to speak? Or can I pop in to see you? It's just never been in the nature of it. With some of the others, Catherine Calderwood was one of those who was in St Andrew's House with me. The number of people in the Scottish Government, however many thousands of people work in the Scottish Government that I hold a mobile phone number for, is extremely limited. It was not my method of communication with Mark Drakeford and Michelle O'Neill. These are discussions with other government leaders that would have been recorded through the normal systems. So I, again, want to be very clear that it was not my practice to not just not take decisions through informal messaging, but have substantial or lengthy or detailed discussions about government decisions through these means. It's not my style, it's not my practice, it's never been my practice, not least because I don't think it is a good or effective or helpful way of reaching decisions, not just taking decisions, but it's not a helpful process in reaching decisions either.
WhatsApp messages between yourself and Mr Youssef and Ms Lloyd were produced by you with your second statement. Where did you get them?
They were provided to me through the Scottish Government.
You obviously didn't have those on your own devices because you deleted them, hadn't you?
I didn't retain them in line with the procedure I've already talked about.
Are you creating a distinction between deletion and retaining?
No.
You had deleted them, had you not?
I think deletion, I think, forgive me, I think sounds as if it was a sort of, not bothering to check whether any information was being retained. I was very thorough, and not just in the pandemic, but in all my work in government, to ensure that things were appropriately recorded, but in line with the advice I'd always been given since my first day in government probably was not to retain conversations like that on a phone that could be lost or stolen and therefore not secure.
But did you delete them?
Yes.
And as far as the other messages are concerned that you couldn't produce yourself between you and all these others, you deleted all of those as well?
In the manner that and after the process that I have set out, yes.
You also produced some direct Twitter messages that you've already mentioned with Professor Leach and Professor Sridhar. Professor Sridhar also produced those messages to us, although slightly later than you, at the beginning of December. Did you have any discussions with her about the production of those messages?
I think I let her know that I'd found messages and would be providing them to the inquiry.
So there was contact between you and her related to the messages?
I simply, as a courtesy, to let her know, yes.
Could I have a look, please, at INQ 000287766? We're both being admonished, I think, Ms Sturgeon, for speaking too quickly for the stenographer. So if we can both try and speak a little more slowly, that would be very much appreciated. These are some extracts from messages between yourself and Ms Lloyd. I'm starting with the one on the 27th of October 2020, 7:10. So just reading through them, it says, I'm having a bit of a crisis, this is you speaking, I'm having a bit of a crisis of decision-making in hospitality, not helped by the fact I haven't slept. The public health argument says stick with 6 PM/NO alcohol, no alcohol for level 3, but I suspect industry will go mad, and I worry we could derail debate, though I suspect that won't happen, and we could commit to listening and changing if we felt necessary. To which Ms Loys replies, my instinct is 6 PM. That's the same as Central Belt now, but some more places open. They have offered further mitigation, so we work with them on delivering those extra mitigations and review at that point. She then follows up, the only alternative would be 8 PM, but no alcohol. Restaurants would like you for that. To which you say it's the same as non-Central Belt. Places can open, but only for food, non-alcohol. 8 PM would be better. I guess, but not sure we can make much of a public health argument for 8 PM alcohol at level 2 and 8 PM no alcohol at level 3. Ms Lloyd replies, that's why I would stick with 6 PM, but if you want to compromise, it would be about giving people regulated places to be in the winter rather than unregulated homes. But no alcohol because it changes behaviour. The difference from now would basically be it's colder and it's darker, so people will be less likely to be outside. You say, OK, we should stick with 6. It's also random, but I think we need to be prepared for a bit of backlash. I've also queried whether we really need the last entry times, and if we do, if we should give on 9:30/10:30. As it stands, there's nothing we can point to say we've listened to industry. Ms Lloyd replies, level 2, 8 PM is listening to them. And then she follows up, and the whole allowing restaurants and pubs to stay open, you say, I suppose, and then she says, there's quite a lot recently. I mean, they'll still be grumpy, but there it is, I think it's meant to say. This is an example of a messaging exchange that would be relevant to someone who would be interested in knowing how decisions in this regard had been arrived at.
Yes, but in many respects, I think this exchange illustrates the answers I've been giving you for context, and I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, but I think this is 7:20 on the morning of the 27th of October 2020. I think I was on my way to a cabinet meeting. I would be in the car from Glasgow. These would be decisions that Cabinet was about to arrive at, and I am simply talking about the things that I would then go into Cabinet and we would talk about, and then would be recorded through the Cabinet minutes, and the decisions that we took. I was probably later that day standing on a public platform talking about some of the decisions that we'd faced, the options that we had, and why we had arrived at the decision that we have arrived at. I can't see it right now, there's a reference in there to I have queried. That's a reference, that's something I had obviously fed in as a question to the advisors who would have been preparing the cabinet minute papers. So in a sense, I look at this and I don't consider that there is anything in that wouldn't be reflected through the decision making and the evidence of the decision-making of the government, and undoubtedly hospitality and the impact of hospitality, the different time limits, that was all very, very much to the fore in public discussion at the time. And I am certain that I would have been talking openly about some of these choices and the fine balances of the very difficult decisions that we were having to take.
Will we find on the corporate record or some other public record that your position was we should stick with 6? It's all so random.
That's The message exchange Mr Dawson starts with, and again, I said earlier on, the reason I don't think WhatsApp messages should be used to have substantial government discussions is because we can look at them almost 4 years later and they're open to different interpretations. That message exchange that you read out started with me, perhaps this is the kind of thing I would prefer not to be on the public record, having a crisis of decision making. It, perhaps is not what I wanted people to know, and that I hadn't slept. At the 27th of October 2020, wouldn't have had a day off since much earlier that year, before March, and had been working. I'm not saying that for sympathy. That was my job and my duty. And there were moments in that where the decisions that we were taking felt almost impossible. That whatever we did, we would cause difficulty and harm to somebody somewhere. And so a phrase like "it's all so random," that probably simply reflects how I felt at 7:20 that morning when I hadn't had much sleep. But by the time I got to Cabinet, I'm sure that I would have collected my thoughts and that we then had a proper discussion and reached a decision that was properly recorded with a good and robust process around it.
This is a discussion related to an important decision made during the course of the management of the pandemic.
That would have then been discussed at Cabinet and recorded through, you've seen all the minutes of the Cabinet, but the minutes of all Cabinet meetings, they don't just record the decision we arrive at. They will record if there's a paper given different options, they will record that, and they record a summary, a précis of the discussion and the points made in these discussions.
Does that record record that your position was, as it stands, there's nothing we can point to say we've listened to industry? I would so I don't have the Cabinet minute from that date in front of me, but I absolutely am certain that around this point in particular, I will have spoken not just in Cabinet meetings, but publicly about the need to listen to industry, to listen to different groups in Scottish society as we arrived at the decisions. We were trying to take decisions that none of us wanted to be taking, and we were trying to reach those decisions in a way that we thought struck the right balance. I'm sure we'll come on to talk later on about the four harms approach that the Scottish Government took. And in that, we were listening as much as we could to different viewpoints. We were not always able to take account of those viewpoints because of the nature of the decisions. So, I am absolutely certain that it would have been not news to anybody that we were struggling with the impact on industry of some of these decisions, and that we were at pains to show that we, as far as we could, given the nature of the decisions that we were taking, we were listening to reasonable points that were being made. Do you think that an interested member of Scottish society, or indeed this inquiry, should take no interest at all in the process by which this decision is made and this discussion's role in it, including the fact that you say it's also random, there's nothing we can point to say we've listened to industry, Ms Lloyd's response, Ms Lloyd's involvement in the discussion, either generally or in relation to this specific issue?
Oh, no, I am not saying the inquiry should have no interest in that. On the contrary, I think the inquiry does have an interest in this, and I think the wider Scottish public would. What I am saying is I do not accept that it would have been unknown to the public at the time that these were the issues we were grappling with. Every day I was taking the public through the different issues that we were grappling with, the balances we were trying to strike, the trade-offs that we were having to make, and the different viewpoints that we were trying as best we could to balance. So, in a sense, this is an example of an exchange that, we look at it now in a WhatsApp, but I don't consider that there is anything in that exchange that would not have been known, that was either on the record and through the Cabinet minutes or in public statements that these were exactly the kind of issues we were trying to reach considered and balanced judgments on.
Thank you. Could I take you to another document, please? This is INQ 000268017. This is another exchange. This is not a group that features you, but it's another piece of evidence that we've seen. And I'd be interested in understanding your reflection on some of the content of the exchange. This is in your capacity as the former First Minister and First Minister at the time. This is in a WhatsApp group chat called COVID Outbreak Group. These messages were provided to the inquiry by Dr Jim McMenamin of Public Health Scotland, who did not delete his messages, and not by the Scottish Government or its officials. In the exchange at 27th of August 2020, you'll recognise, no doubt, the individuals involved. Ken Thompson says, just to remind you seriously, this is discoverable under FOI. Know where the clear chat button is, to which Nicola Steadman replies, yes, absolutely. Jason Leach points out DG level input there. Mr Thompson says, plausible deniability are my middle names. Now clear it again. Jason Leach says, done. Nicola Steadman, me too. And someone called Donna Bell and me. Were you aware in your capacity as First Minister that these sort of exchanges took place and that a senior member of the civil service considered plausible deniability to be his middle name?
As you said at the outset of the question, I was not a member of this group until some of these exchanges were explored in evidence sessions last week. I had never seen these messages before. Did I know that there would be WhatsApp groups where officials were exchanging information? I'm not sure I was particularly conscious of it, but I would have, had I been asked to stop and consider that, I would have said, well, I would assume so, given the nature of how people we're working. I would absolutely expect all officials in the Scottish Government to retain, in line with Scottish Government policies, information relevant to our decision making. I look at that exchange and what I don't see is an exchange about the decisions we're taking. I see a light-hearted discussion between officials. Ken Thompson, I know, has been before you and has given his interpretation of that, so he can answer and has answered for himself. I would read that as him reminding people of the need to be professional on WhatsApp, even when discussing light-hearted things. The other thing I would say about all of these individuals on the screen before me is that they are all, in my knowledge and experience, and with some of them, particularly Ken Thompson, this is extensive experience. They are public servants of the utmost integrity. And at this point and throughout the pandemic, they were public servants who were working in a committed and a dedicated fashion in terms of the hours, and they were working the pressure under which they were working above and beyond probably the call of duty. Ken Thompson is somebody I've worked with throughout my time in the Scottish Government, and he is a civil servant, as I say, of the utmost integrity and the utmost professionalism.
This group was called COVID Outbreak Group, obviously connected to the COVID pandemic, yes?
If that is what you're telling me, yes.
One assumes, yes, that is the name of it. One assumes, therefore, it's to do with COVID Outbreak Group, to do with COVID, and therefore relevant to the pandemic. What Mr Thompson does here is that, despite recognising that material in this chat is discoverable under freedom of information legislation, is to tell other individuals in the group that they should clear it or delete it. Is that not correct?
That is what is in front of me, yes.
Could I just go a little bit further down, please? I'm just tracing the messages down to 1617, so very shortly after the exchange that we've had. At 1617, so this is just a couple of minutes after. Further down, you can see in the background what happens in between. There is something which Jason Leach says at 1617 which is redacted, and then Ken Thompson says the information you requested is not held centrally. Is that a phrase you recognise? Of course it is, yes. Is that a phrase which often appears in freedom of information requests when documentation is requested from the Scottish Government? Yes. Is it a phrase which indicates, as a result of a request, the Scottish Government is not in a position to be able to provide the information it might otherwise because it doesn't actually hold the information in its central repository? Yes. Does it look to you that this is Ken Thompson suggesting that that response is an excuse often trotted out by the Scottish Government in response to freedom of information requests?
I absolutely accept that as an interpretation that can be put on it. These are not my words.
Of course.
This is not an exchange I'm involved in, so there is a limit to how far I can go in trying to interpret what he meant by that. In looking at the exchange, my interpretation of it, which may or may not be correct, is that he is reminding the others on the in the chat that the kind of things they are talking about, they probably shouldn't be on a chat like this. You know, somebody says, I was a nippy teenager in 1986, for example. That's the nature of that. Again, all I can repeat about Ken Thompson is that he is a civil servant, in my experience, who took the responsibilities around recording and making sure that the government record was complete extremely seriously. He's one of the civil servants in my experience that was not just most experienced in that, but that was most assiduous in that side of things. So I can't answer for him. I can speak about my experience of him, and I can give an interpretation based on the context of that was meant to be a light-hearted comment, but that is only my interpretation. Forgive me, the other thing I would say, like many people, given, and I can reflect back to this time, our discussions in government were very serious. There are times when they were extremely sombre. There were days when they were very, very dark, given the nature of what we were dealing with. And because the public as a whole were going through unimaginable trauma at the time, many of them still living with that trauma, reading now light-hearted exchanges, I think, can be very difficult because it gives an impression that people were not taking the situation seriously. That could not be further from the truth. I think what you have there are public servants who were working incredibly hard to take the best decisions, to support ministers to take the best decisions to keep people safe, who were, you know, perhaps, as is human nature, occasionally engaging in light-hearted comment to try to probably get themselves through the day. That's my interpretation of what's before me, but I appreciate others may arrive at a different one.
If it were ultimately to be determined that there was a culture of plausible deniability, a culture of deleting messages that would be recoverable under FOI requests, a culture of suggesting, in order to get out of FOI requests, that documents are not held centrally, these would be abhorrent revelations, would they not?
Absolutely, and to be very clear, that is not the culture that I believe existed in the Scottish Government during my time as First Minister, or indeed in my time as Deputy First Minister.
And if those things were deemed to be the reality of your time, the culture in your time as First Minister, that would be a serious breach of the bond of trust between the Government and the Scottish public, which we discussed as being very much at the cornerstone of your whole approach.
If that was the case, and let me repeat, it is not my view that it was, then yes, what you're putting to me would be true. I would, again, and you will take me through, no doubt, lots of documentation later, but that single page, and I'm sure there will be other pages of WhatsApp messages that you could put in front of me, I would counterpose to the, you know, in the region of 100 cabinet papers and minutes that properly, seriously recorded the decision-making and the underpinning rationale for the decision-making of the government. The bond of trust between any government and the public at any time is of paramount importance, but this was particularly the case during the extraordinary and unprecedented situation we faced in the pandemic, and it was something I felt to my core every single day of that.
We saw in messages that we looked at in some detail with Professor Sridhar that you had suggested to her that she might contact you via either your SNP email address or your government email address. Was the suggestion that she might use your SNP email address an appropriate thing to have done in the conduct of your government business?
In reflection, perhaps I shouldn't have done that, but if I had been trying to direct her to a personal email, SNP or otherwise, to keep something off the government system, then I would suggest I wouldn't also have given her my government email address. I wasn't, and obviously the inquiry has looked at that message, I wasn't pushing her in one direction or the other. What I was saying this was, I think from memory, in June 2020 or thereabouts, still a very, very tough, critical phase of the pandemic. Effectively, what I was saying to her is, if there are things you think I should know, don't stand on ceremony. I'd rather know. And at that point, I was, as I think any responsible decision maker should have been, I was trying to deepen my knowledge. I was trying to learn as much as I could about the virus and how to combat the virus. I was desperate to understand different perspectives. I was desperate to understand as much as I could from the experiences and the responses of other countries. Now, let me be very clear, the bulk of that was coming to me through Scottish Government advisers. But I had a thirst to understand as much as possible, and I simply wanted her. She was somebody who had been appearing in the media a lot. I was periodically asked about views that she had been expressing in the media, and I wanted to have an understanding, a deeper understanding of what they were. But if I'd been in any way trying to direct her to a private email address, I doubt if I would have put my government email address in there as well. And of course, the context of what we were talking about was, I think, a paper that she was sharing with the wider advisory group. At no point did Professor Sridhar send me anything that was, for my eyes only, that wasn't either publicly available information or information that was being shared with the advisory group she was a member of.
I think we have seen some emails now that were very recently produced to us by the Scottish Government between yourself and Professor Sridhar, which do, I think, as the direct message exchanges suggest, indicate that she was forwarding on to you policy papers, which I think your position is that those would otherwise have been made available to you. Is that right? Have I got that right?
Yes, these were, she was a member, and I know the inquiry is aware of this, she was a member of the Scottish Government
group, yeah.
COVID-19 advisory group, and these were papers she was preparing for the group. What the group did with them, or what weight it gave to them, that would be for the group to answer, but these were not things that she was preparing for me and sending to me alone. They were simply copies of things that were in wider circulation.
It would, one assumes, be in accordance with the normal practice of the group, that the group would decide whether that needed to be sent to you rather than Professor Sridhar, isn't that right?
Possibly, yes, but at that point, and if this was the wrong approach to take, Mr Dawson, I apologise. At that point, in dealing with an unprecedented situation and a pandemic, I wanted to understand as much as I could. I wanted my decisions to be as informed as possible. I read, perhaps one of the reasons why in the early exchange I was saying I hadn't slept much. I read extensively from public sources of articles and research studies online. I was trying to understand as much as possible and as quickly as possible. And I took the view, if somebody could help me with that, if somebody could send me something that I would otherwise see, but I might see. I'm not even sure, with my apologies to her, that I would have necessarily read everything she sent me, because I might already have seen it, or I would perhaps not think it was particularly relevant. But I had a desire to have as much information in order to deepen my understanding of the situation we were facing as I could. And while there are things we may talk about today where I think, if I was to go back and have my time again, I would take a different decision. I hope I wouldn't take a different decision on that. It was important to me to be as informed and as educated as I possibly could be.
You used a personal phone for the conduct of government business while First Minister, is that correct?
Yes, I did.
And you never used a government-issued phone, is that right? We've heard evidence from a variety of ministers that they seem to use phones from a variety of different sources, some Scottish Government, some personal, some Scottish Parliament issued phones. Is it appropriate in your view as the former First Minister that ministers are conducting business on phones that are not government issued phones?
It was never suggested to me at any time during my period as First Minister that it was not appropriate. The reason I used a personal phone was that I didn't want to have multiple devices. A government phone, I wouldn't have been able to do constituency business or party or personal matters, and on a constituency one I can do the others. You get the picture here. Yes. So I wanted to have one device. It was never suggested to me that was inappropriate, and I don't believe it was inappropriate. I think any phone, whether it is personal, parliament, government, is vulnerable to being left on a train or lost somehow, which goes back to points I made earlier on about the practice and the policy around how information is retained in government.
We've been made aware of an article which appeared in the press just yesterday suggesting that your expenses claims indicated that on the 19th of March you purchased a phone and a number of SIM top-ups. And the article also suggests that you purchased a second prepaid phone in between 2020 and 2021 because it's based on your expenses claims, I think, and the amounts are there. Why did you purchase those phones, and why did you? They
were purchased certainly through my expenses on my authority. I didn't personally purchase them. They were also not for use by me. Many MSPs, I believe, did the same when the pandemic started, and my constituency office staff could no longer work.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Sergeant. Just to be clear, we're obviously keen on understanding whether they were used for your business related to the COVID pandemic in the conduct of your role as First Minister.
They were not used
if they're used for some other purpose, we have no interest.
They were the phones that my constituency office landline were diverted to in the homes of my constituency office staff. I have never, to the best of my knowledge, seen, held and certainly not used any of these phones.
Thank you for clarifying that. My lady, as I'm about to move on to a different topic, if that's an appropriate moment.
Certainly. I suspect we may be getting messages that the stenographer is struggling. I appreciate it's very difficult to change one's pattern of speech, but maybe if you paused before asking the next question, Mr Dawson, so the stenographer can catch up.
I'll try my very best, my lady, yes.
Thank you. 11:30.
So this is an exchange in which they are discussing a cabinet meeting. The reference to she is you, I think.
I assume so.
Yes. Do you recall this period just broadly, and we'll get into some of the details?
I recall the period, not just broadly, I recall it in detail. I recall the cabinet meeting in detail too.
Excellent. Yeah. I think what the context is, if I understand it from the evidence that we've heard from Mr Youssef and indeed Ms Forbes, is that there were discussions around the possibility of having further measures, but there were issues pertaining to whether or not there would be funding to support business if there were a further lockdown or further restrictions. And that at the Cabinet meeting, Mr Youssef, Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care, had suggested somewhat out of the blue, I think Ms Forbes told us, that he, despite efforts made to try to find funding to assist for that purpose, he had managed to find within his budget £100 million, which wasn't previously known about. Is that correct? Please correct me if I've got that wrong.
I think it's broadly correct. If I may, I can go into
what I'm really interested in is the possibility, is the suggestion that I'll make to you, that this is indicative of a culture in which you did not take kindly to people bringing up at cabinet meetings things that you had not already had brought to your attention and on which you had not already made a decision.
No, that is absolutely not the case. There was no such culture within the government I led. I think, if I may, in order to answer that question properly, I need to set out the circumstances of that cabinet meeting. I had, in advance of that cabinet meeting, asked Ms Forbes, as the Finance Secretary, to undertake an exercise across government to ascertain, we were finding it difficult with the UK government in the financial discussions at that point, to ascertain if there was money we could redirect, free up, make available from within the Scottish Government budget to give additional support to businesses should we require to impose additional restrictions. Ms Forbes had done that exercise. She had done it rigorously and robustly, and she had reported at Cabinet that the outcome of this, having gone round all of the portfolios, was that there wasn't really any money of any significant scale to have. At which point, Mr Youssef, and let me say, Mr Youssef was doing this for the best of intentions, I'm not questioning his motives, said, well, actually, and I'm paraphrasing here, obviously, I can make £100 million available. In that moment, I felt he was doing a real disservice to the Finance Secretary, because she had just reported that she had done a job and it had resulted in no money being available, and then he, seemed to take the feet from her in that. I supported and believe is important that there were robust discussions around the Cabinet table. There were robust discussions around the Cabinet table, but I expected all my ministers to operate on a basis of mutual respect and of making sure that they were operating collegiately. And in that moment, I didn't think that was the case, and I was not particularly happy about it. I have to concede that. I think that was probably exacerbated by the fact that, and I can't recall the date, you perhaps will be able to show it to me, I think sometime maybe a couple of weeks before that, Mr Youssef had indicated to me on WhatsApp that he might be able to find some money in this order. And my response to him was, speak to Kate. And at that meeting, it appeared that he hadn't done so. So that was the context. And I perhaps was also sceptical given the pressures on the National Health Service at that point, that it would be sensible to take £100 million from dealing with the acute pressures on the health service to fund business support, but that is more of a substantive issue. So that is the context of that. As First Minister, I make no apology for this. I always tried to lead from the front. I always took the buck stops with me attitude. I always took Cabinet meetings extremely seriously, made sure I was briefed and had done all the preparation and reading, and I expected similar from my Cabinet Secretaries, and I think that is how good government should work. So that's the context of that. That was not a regular occurrence at Cabinet. It was a very particular set of circumstances that As it happens, I'm not sure that exchange doesn't slightly overstate it, but I do concede that I expressed some displeasure at the process by which the offer had come to the table. And it was more on behalf of Ms Forbes, because I thought it did a disservice to her and the very professional job that she had done.
But we've heard Ms Forbes on this very subject, so we know what her position in that regard is. Do these messages show, Ms Sturgeon, that whilst Cabinet Secretaries might complain in private, as in these as we've just seen, they would ultimately be expected to fall back in line behind your view on matters? No, absolutely not. I suspect in every government everywhere across the world, and I would imagine that the Scottish Government was no different, that ministers will, moan about the First Minister or the Prime Minister to each other. Maybe I used to do it in a previous job in the Scottish Government as well. So that is normal. But I expected Cabinet discussions, and Cabinet discussions were full, robust, detailed. I expected all Cabinet Secretaries to come to those discussions able to argue their point, put their point of view across, and then for us to come to a position at the end of that. That's how Cabinet government works. It was absolutely not the case. And I've referenced Cabinet minutes before, and you have seen all the Cabinet minutes in relation to COVID, but this would be true of Cabinet minutes generally. There is usually, 2-3 pages in a Cabinet minute that in detail summarises the discussion, the points that were raised. It doesn't attribute those points to individuals. That's not how Cabinets are minuted, but it goes into detail about the points raised. So you can look across all of these minutes and see the nature and the detail of the discussion that has been had. And that is how I operated within government, and it's how I would have expected all my Cabinet Secretaries to operate. You can't see these views in the Cabinet minutes? Possibly not, but that I think certainly not. You would see, for example, the discussion about money. You would see the discussion about the fact that there had been an exercise to try to find additional resources. Could I ask you to go, please, to INQ 0002147434, please? Bottom of page 6. If we just go to the first page, please, can we do that? Just to see what it is. These are conclusions, as we've come to understand. They're called minutes of the Cabinet meeting held on the 22nd of June 2021. Does that appear correct? Yes. And if we could go to page 7, please. Just again to try to contextualise this, our understanding is that this is around the time either at or shortly before cases started to rise again as a result of the Delta wave hitting Scotland. Would that be broadly your recollection? Of that time period, yes. Thank you. I'm looking at the decisions taken under subparagraph P and Q, maybe over the page. Yes, thank you. These are the matters decided by Cabinet. It says, for the purposes of COVID-19 decision-making during the summer recess, to delegate to the First Minister decisions that were broadly consistent with the strategic framework and timetable, noting that the First Minister will be supported as required by the gold group structure of key ministers, including Mr Swinney, Mr Youssef, Ms Forbes and any other ministers with an interest with input from, name redacted, chief advisers and senior lead officials. And under Q, over the page, in the event that the First Minister and Gold Group were to reach a decision that differed materially from the strategic framework, that Cabinet should be advised through correspondence, and if the First Minister requested it at a meeting of the Cabinet, which she could convene at any time, should circumstances require. Is the reference there to the Gold Group, a group which is sometimes called Gold or Gold Command? It is indeed, and it's an example, and I mean this in the nicest possible way, of the civil service often attaching names, grand names, yes, to meetings that are otherwise routine. Yes. Our understanding, Ms Sturgeon, is that this was a group which, please correct me if I've got this wrong, but our understanding is that it was a group which tended to meet. It didn't always have the same people in it. It was almost certainly always you. I think it was always you. But it would tend to meet in the days before a cabinet meeting, which would, if regularly scheduled, would take place on a Tuesday. Is that right? So sometimes over the weekend, for example, I think we've seen.
Yes, so cabinets routinely met on a Tuesday. I'm sure there were periods during COVID when we met on other days, but routinely a Tuesday. The Gold Group, which was a name I didn't ascribe to, it came to be known as that, was initially an opportunity for me and for other ministers as appropriate to interrogate the data, to ask questions of advisers, and before we even got to the point of shaping the proposals that would go to Cabinet for decision, to start to, in our own minds, firm up the direction we thought we were going in. I should be very clear that the Gold Group, Gold Command, whatever terminology we want to use, was not a decision-making or a formal governance body. The Gold Group would not have reached a decision, and actually I think the rest of that paragraph makes that quite clear, that had the Gold Group wanted to propose a decision, that would have had to have gone through a proper Cabinet process. And just to be clear, Cabinet correspondence, I think in the UK Government as well as the Scottish Government, it's not the preferred way of reaching Cabinet decisions, but it is a way in which Cabinet decisions can be reached short of a meeting. I don't think that happened in this case, but so that paragraph there makes very clear that the previous paragraph, which is not before me right now.
If we just put the previous one back up, please. Thank you.
Again, it is... it's making... So this was in the summer of 2021. People are aware of how far into the pandemic that was. I suspect this was an attempt to give ministers some time off over the summer period. Everybody had obviously been working in some periods round the clock on this. But it's very clear that I am not being given, through a delegation, a carte blanche to take decisions I want to take. It is talking there about any decisions that are broadly consistent with the strategic framework and timetable. So we had already set out at that point the milestones that we wanted to reach. And as sometimes was the case, Cabinet would delegate to me. So Cabinet would say, we want to do this, assuming the data on such and such a date supports it. And when we got that data, I would make a judgment, well, does the data support it? And so formally, I would have delegated power to make the final decision. But the process of decision-making was through Cabinet, and I think that makes that clear.
Well, might I suggest to you, Ms Sturgeon, that contrary to your interpretation, this in fact gives you an incredibly wide discretion as to what you might wish to do in the management of the pandemic, saying that all you need to do is to make decisions, and it is making decisions, which were broadly consistent with the strategic framework and timetable. That would mean you could do virtually anything.
With respect, I would challenge that and say that is not the case. The strategic framework, by its nature, strategic frameworks are broad and high level, but the timetable was very detailed. To depart from that, I would not have had latitude to depart from that. Departing from that would have required me to go through a decision-making process, and I did not have carte blanche, wide latitude to take decisions, and nor should I have had, incidentally, nor would I have wanted to, given the seriousness of what we were dealing with. I'm not sure anybody would have chosen to take solely onto their own shoulders the decisions that were falling to be made, although I always accepted that the final accountability and responsibility as First Minister lay with me. So I respectfully don't think the characterisation of that is accurate at all. And I think if you were to look at Cabinet, forgive me, there was a Cabinet minute discussed with Mr Swinney yesterday, I think from the 19th of December 2020, where conclusions were put to him similar to that. Decisions are delegated to the First Minister. Looking at only those conclusions would have given the impression that has been given now. But when you look at the minute in its entirety, the previous 2 pages of that narrate the Cabinet discussion, make very clear that Cabinet agreed with the decisions that were being proposed, and that there had been a full and comprehensive discussion. So yes, when we look at paragraphs like that in isolation, I accept that gives a certain impression that is, I would say, is not accurate, but also would not be the impression given if these minutes are read in their entirety.
You mentioned in your explanation, your helpful explanation, that the process would be that there would be a discussion to ascertain whether Cabinet agreed with the decisions that were proposed. Does that not lead to the conclusion that decisions had already been reached and that Cabinet was in effect a decision ratifying rather than a decision-making body?
No, that's not the case, because in many of these instances, there was not one proposal put forward. Cabinet would have a range of different options. One Cabinet we may come on to talk to later on at a later stage to this, as we go into the latter part, into Christmas of 2021, when Omicron has been identified. That Cabinet has, and I'm using this just as an illustrative example, there will be many others, it has three options. Effectively stick with the measures we have in place just now, enhance them in some way, or have a circuit breaker. Cabinet has a full discussion and then it reaches a decision. So it was not always the case that Cabinet simply had a proposal put to it that it could take or leave. Cabinet would have a range of options. The exchange that we talked about before the break between Liz Lloyd and I is reflective of that. There were options that Cabinet would have been chewing over and coming to a balanced view of.
We can judge that ourselves, as you said earlier, from the Cabinet conclusions.
Absolutely, yes.
The gold or gold command meetings, accepting that you don't like the term, that seems to be what they were at least colloquially referred to as. They are somewhat mysterious to us in the sense that they weren't minuted, were they?
There were not minutes taken of them in the way that you have Cabinet minutes. That is certainly the case, because they were not decision-making meetings in the way Cabinet meetings were. However, and I believe, forgive me if I'm misinformed here, I believe the inquiry has papers that went with and around those meetings, slide packs that would inform the discussion, agendas of the issues we were going to discuss, and where there had been actions out of these meetings, usually to do further work to inform decisions, then notes of action points. And I've certainly, the committee, the inquiry, apologies, had asked me to review some of that. So I've reviewed that paperwork, and I know that that is there. But in many of these meetings, the purpose of them was, Cabinet had choices and options, but no Cabinet on any issue, anywhere, sits with a blank sheet of paper. So there is a process of shaping the options that will then become the decisions that Cabinet takes. And these meetings were often to try to shape those options. So in a sense, the output of those meetings, and I use this term loosely, the minutes of those meetings are the Cabinet papers that then go to Cabinet for decision, because that is what comes from these meetings into the Cabinet papers that then inform and shape the decisions Cabinet reaches.
We've certainly had access to certain action points. They don't relate to every gold meeting. We've struggled rather to work out even when the gold meetings took place. We have to look at other documents to tell us when they might have happened. We have seen action points, not in relation to all of the meetings that appear to have happened. But the action points appear very much to be effectively the conclusion of the meeting, rather than any discussion as to how those conclusions were reached. Therefore, is it fair to say that the documentation to which you refer does not tell us the salient points that were discussed in the conduct of government business at those meetings?
So I think, yes, I think that would be fair, and there is undoubtedly a learning point for government here, and it's not any longer for me, but I'm sure the Scottish Government will be reflecting on this. I think around, the impression that can be created when you give, grand names to fairly routine meetings, and I've already made that point, but more substantively, to make sure that there is a clearer record of these discursive, non-decision-making meetings that are discursive and there for the purpose of shaping the decisions that have to be taken by Cabinet. So, yes, I would accept that can, to somebody outside the process, it would be helpful if that was clearer. I can look at Cabinet papers, not minutes, but Cabinet papers, putting the proposals for decision or the options for decision to Cabinet, and I know that that effectively reflects the discussion that we would have had in these meetings, because that was how we shaped the options and decisions that were coming to Cabinet.
Is there a theme developing in the areas we've already looked at, Ms Sturgeon, that the Scottish Government does not like light to be shined on the way in which discussions leading to decisions have taken place?
No, I would very, very strongly refute that. And, this is a point I've made a number of times already this morning, and forgive me for repeating it, but I do think it is extremely important. I have, in preparation for coming here today, and some of these the committees specifically drawn my attention to, I have looked at all of the Cabinet papers and minutes over that whole period. It runs to thousands of pages, and that paperwork doesn't simply record the decision that was reached. It records.
And there's absolutely no reason why an electric arc furnace built at Port Talbot, using support from the UK Government, cannot help support our defence industry in years to come.
Emma Hardy.
Question number 9, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I have regular discussions with ministerial colleagues on a range of topics, including on justice matters. The Government is committed to supporting victims. By 2025, we will have quadrupled funding in England and Wales for victim and witness support service from 2010 levels.
Emma Hardy.
Mr Speaker, 9 in 10 crimes went unsolved in Wales in the last 6 months. What does the Minister say to the victims of the 82,000 unsolved crimes?
Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I would point to this Government's record on crime. Last week's Office of National Statistics crime survey shows drops in all major crime types, an average reduction of around 50%. Violent crime is down 51%, neighbourhood crime is down 48%, and theft is down 46%. That's due in part to the fact that this Government has met its commitment to provide 20,000 extra police officers, and my own force, David Powis, has now got an extra 143 officers.
Robin Miller.
Question 11.
Sarah State.
Mr Speaker, I have regular discussions with Cabinet colleagues and delivery teams in DLUC on the progress of Levelling Up Fund projects in Wales, and I look forward to hearing more about the projects which are taking place in the Honourable Gentleman's constituency.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Moor in Mynydd sea to mountain active travel route in the Conway Valley received an £18.6 million boost through Levelling Up funds, and the project will make a positive difference to communities in Glan Conwy, in Betws-y-Coed and Trefrw. Apart from unlocking the Conway Valley to visitors, it will help young people get to school safely and workers to their jobs. Now, I meet regularly with Conwy Council on progress on those projects. What is my right honourable friend doing to ensure that Levelling Up funds are being delivered effectively in Wales?
Mr Speaker, can I firstly congratulate my honourable friend for being such a champion of Levelling Up Fund schemes in his own constituency. The Levelling Up Funds have allowed us to commit to keep our post-Brexit promise to ensure that Wales continues to be generously funded. And Mr Speaker, it is one of many such projects, such as the Levelling Up Funds, the free ports and investment zones that are ensuring Wales levels up.
Like the towns and villages I represent, coalfield communities in Wales are still bearing the brunt of deindustrialisation. I'm delighted that we're going to have a debate tomorrow on miners and mining communities, and I encourage Welsh colleagues to attend. Can the Minister tell us what steps he's taken to ensure that levelling up funding in Wales and across the coalfields in the UK is targeted at the most deprived, left behind areas that have suffered most?
Mr Speaker, the honourable gentleman is absolutely right to say that we do need to target the areas most in need, but that is exactly what this government has been doing. And it's not just been about levelling up funds, Mr Speaker. We have had 4 growth deals going on across the length and breadth of Wales, 3 rounds of levelling up funding. We've had 2 investment zones, 2 free ports, an electrified rail line in North Wales and an electrified arc furnace in South Wales. And the reality is, Mr Speaker, that while we are committed to levelling up, the Welsh Labour Government are committed to levying further taxes on people and businesses in Wales.
Before we come to Prime Minister's questions, can I say that recent exchanges have been lively to the point where it's becoming difficult for colleagues to hear what is being said clearly, and there has been an escalation in unhelpful exchanges across the floor of the House from sedentary positions and the attempted use of props. Some of the language used in questions has also fallen short of the standards and good temper and moderation that should characterise the proceedings of this House. I know there is a general election approaching, but I would urge honourable members on both sides of the House to exercise greater self-restraint in their choice of words and in their general behaviour, both when they are asking a question and when they are not. We now come to Prime Minister's questions. Joanna Cherry.
Number one, please, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on Monday I met the families of Grace O'Malley Kumar, Barnaby Webber and Ian Coates, who were killed in Nottingham. I assured them that we would do whatever it takes to get the answers that they want. And Mr. Speaker, following constructive dialogue over past months, I welcome the significant steps the DUP have taken to make restoration of the executive possible. I also thank the other political parties in Northern Ireland for the patience that they have shown. After 2 years without an executive, there is now the prospect of power sharing back up and running, strengthening our union, giving people the local accountable government that they need, and offering a brighter future for Northern Ireland. My right honourable friend, the Northern Ireland Secretary, will be making a statement shortly. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others in addition to my duties in this House. I shall have further such meetings later today.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week I met with a constituent who was employed not by the post office but by a supermarket who operated a franchise post office. She was wrongly accused of dishonesty as a result of the faulty Horizon system, and she was put through a disciplinary process by her employers, the supermarket. This has had a very profound impact on her life. She's not alone, there are others in her position, and yet there's no provision for compensating people who worked in franchise post offices like her. Will the Prime Minister give me a commitment to include these victims in the Horizon scandal compensation scheme?
Well, first of all, can I say I'm very sorry to hear about the Honourable Lady's constituent's case. As I've said, this was an awful miscarriage of justice, and everyone affected deserved not just justice but also compensation and answers. I'll make sure that we look into the precise details of her constituent's case, and surely there will be others like that, and make sure that the Minister gets back to her with all due haste.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sustainable aviation fuel plays a significant part in the sector's decarbonisation. Will my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, commit to further policies for a SAF mandate to generate greater demand, for a revenue support mechanism such as other sectors, solar and wind power generation as well, and so that work starts by the end of next year on the 5 promised sustainable aviation plants here in the UK?
Prime Minister.
I can give my honourable friend the assurance that we are committed to ensuring the SAF mandate will be in place by 2025. And by mandating the use of sustainable aviation fuel, not only will we be able to deliver carbon savings, but also create a brand new UK market. And as one of the steps in introducing the revenue certainty mechanism that he talks about by 2026, DfT will be consulting in the spring this year on options for how that should work in practice.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in welcoming the DUP statement about the return of the Northern Ireland Executive? This is an important moment, and we now need all sides to work together to get Stormont back up and running for the people of Northern Ireland. Mr. Speaker, I too met the families of Grace, Barnaby and Ian on Monday, and it's impossible to express in words the horror that they've been through and continue to go through, and we must all redouble our efforts to do everything that we can to help them with their campaign. And of course, Mr. Speaker, this week 2 young lives, 16-year-old Max and 15-year-old Mason, were taken in Bristol, and I know the whole House will join me in sending condolences to their families and their friends. Mr. Speaker, one of the most difficult experiences for any member of this House is speaking to those at the sharp end of this government's cost of living crisis. So nobody could fail to be moved by the plight of the member for Mid Norfolk. His mortgage has gone up £1,200 a month. He's been forced to quit his dream job to pay for it. A Tory MP counting the cost of Tory chaos. After 14 years, have we finally discovered what they meant when they said, "We're all in this together"?
Well, Mr. Speaker, thanks to the mortgage charter that the Chancellor introduced last year, millions of mortgage holders across the country are benefiting from support with their mortgages, because it's important, rather than take the approach that the honourable gentleman just did, is actually focus on the practical support in place to help people who do need help. And someone on a typical mortgage is able to now save hundreds of pounds thanks to those reforms. And actually what we have recently seen is mortgage applications now at a multi-month high as a result of confidence returning. But if he really cared about helping people with the cost of living, Mr. Speaker, he would actually do more to celebrate and acknowledge the fact that thanks to our plan, millions of working people will now start to pay hundreds of pounds less in tax from this month's pay slips, Mr. Speaker. But we all know that's not a priority for him. He said he wanted to back people with the cost of living, but now he has described tax cuts, I read, as salting the earth. His shadow chancellor, it seems, is equally confused. In Davos, she said she did back tax cuts, but back here in Westminster, she called them a scorched earth policy. She obviously can't decide which Wikipedia page to copy this week.
Mr. Speaker, for every £2 he says he's giving people back, he's taking £10 out of their back pocket in higher tax, and he thinks they should be dancing in the street and thanking him. There are 200,000 people, Prime Minister, just like the member for Mid-Norfolk, coming off fixed-rate mortgages and paying more each and every month because they crashed the economy. Does the Prime Minister actually know how much their monthly repayments are going up by?
Prime Minister, as I said, Mr. Speaker, someone on a typical mortgage of about £140,000 with 17 years left is currently paying around £800 as a result of the ability to extend their mortgage term or switch to a 6-month-only interest-only mortgage. They will be able to save hundreds of pounds, and that is someone on the average mortgage, Mr. Speaker. But again, Mr. Speaker, he says he cares about the cost of living. The thing that would have the biggest impact on everyone's cost of living is the fact that his ideas to spend £28 billion, which we had just confirmed this morning by a Shadow Treasury Minister, I heard, confirmed that they remain committed to them, but he has no plan to pay for this £28 billion, Mr. Speaker. No plan at all. And that's typical Labour economics, because they want to keep the spending but drop the payment plan. And I actually saw at the weekend their former leader, his mentor, was clear that they'll make their sums add up with tax rises on people's assets. Their homes, their pensions and their businesses. It's the same old Labour Party, Mr. Speaker. No plan and back to square one with higher taxes.
Mr. Speaker, they've crashed the economy, mortgages are through the roof, they've doubled the debt, and he thinks he can stand there and lecture other people about fiscal responsibility. But he didn't answer the question. Hundreds of thousands of people are coming off fixed-rate mortgages and facing huge mortgage increases. And the Prime Minister won't even do them the courtesy of answering the question. No, he didn't. So I'll ask him again.
I was very clear at the beginning, and I mean that my constituents to hear it. If yours don't, please leave. Keir Starmer.
Does the Prime Minister have any idea how much mortgages are going up by this month for those coming off fixed-rate mortgages?
Prime Minister. Well, again, I'll just point him back to my previous answer, Mr. Speaker, as I went him through. Everyone's situation will be different. As someone on a typical mortgage of around £140,000, who's currently paying £800, will be able to keep their mortgage payment essentially the same by using the facilitations that the Chancellor has put in place. But again, that's what we've done to help people, Mr. Speaker. But again, it's incumbent on him to explain to the British public how his his policy of decarbonising the grid by 2030 is going to be funded. He won't give the answers, but helpfully the Shadow Energy Secretary popped up at the weekend in an interview in the Sunday Times. He said they don't need a plan to pay for it, Mr. Speaker, because in his words it will produce real savings and it makes clear economic sense. Now, the Shadow Leader here doesn't want to talk about it at all, but let me tell him, I see all these years later it's the same story. The Right Honourable Member for Doncaster North has carved a promise in stone and everyone else just looks away in embarrassment.
Mr. Speaker, he just doesn't get it. They crashed the economy, mortgages skyrocketing, doubling the debt. They say they're going to max out the government's credit card at the next budget, but he won't.
Order. I think the Chief Whip's getting very carried away. He doesn't want to lead everybody for a cup of tea, does he? Come on.
They have forfeited the right to be lecturing others about the economy. Somebody coming off a fixed-rate mortgage is going to be paying an average of £240 more each and every month. A constant reminder that working people are paying the price for the damage that they've done to the economy. This week, I met one of the employees at Iceland in Warrington, Phil. I'm sure Phil would be...
Order. Mr Gibson. Sorry. Mr Starmer. Order. The same voice keeps appearing again. It won't appear anymore. So I'm just letting you know now. Keir Starmer.
Laughing at an employee at Iceland who's struggling with his mortgage. Shame. He told me that his mortgage is going up by a staggering £1,000 a month, Prime Minister. He doesn't want other averages, other people, other stories. That's what's happening to him. If the member for Mid Norfolk on £120,000 can't afford this Tory government, how on earth can people like Phil?
Well, actually, Mr. Speaker, thanks to the management of the economy, Phil and millions of people like him are now ensuring that inflation is less than half of the rate that it was when we were talking a year ago, putting more money in their pocket. And thanks to this government, Phil and millions of other workers, not just at Iceland, but across the country, are benefiting this month in their pay packet for a tax cut worth hundreds of pounds for someone on an average salary. But I hope he explained to Phil the cost of his policies. Did he explain to Phil how Phil is going to have to pay for his £28 billion green spending spree, how it's going to cost Phil in higher taxes, more coming out of his pay packet, and did he explain to Phil that he'd be better off sticking with our plan rather than going back to square one with him?
I would invite the Prime Minister to get in touch with Phil and explain to him how paying £1,000 more on his mortgage is making him better off, because that's not how he feels. He's just so out of touch. It's unbelievable. Finding hundreds of pounds extra a month, that may not seem like a big deal to the Prime Minister. But let me tell him, most people don't have that sort of money knocking around. And if that wasn't bad enough, Mr. Speaker, this week he told every council in the country to put their council tax up by the maximum of 5%. That's 26 tax rises now, Prime Minister. And he says everything's fine, people are better off. But when people see their mortgages going up, their council tax going up, food prices still going up, who does he expect them to believe? His boasts or their bank account?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, I was puzzled because, again, he resorts, as always, to the politics of envy here. But after recently and repeatedly attacking not just me but the government for lifting the bonus cap, I was genuinely surprised to see that the Shadow Chancellor just today has announced that she now supports the government's policy on the bankers' bonus cap. I don't know if he mentioned that to Phil when he was having a chat with him, but I'm sure he can fill us in. But I can tell him that trust and economic credibility come from sticking to a plan. But it's becoming clear you cannot trust a word that he says. And again, when the Shadow Chancellor says or claims that they won't borrow much, they won't raise Phil's taxes, we now know that those promises simply, again, they just aren't worth the Wikipedia page they were copied from.
Mr. Speaker, I actually didn't expect him to be laughing at Phil. I did not expect him to be laughing at Phil, not addressing.
Hold on. Look, I made this statement very clear. I don't, Prime Minister, it's very serious that we make sure that people hear, both you and the Leader of the Opposition. It matters to the people who watch the proceedings of this chamber, and it's not good in the behaviour that seems to be carried out. Prime Minister.
The Prime Minister just doesn't get how hard it is for millions of people across the country like Phil. That is the primary problem, struggling with their mortgages, their bills, the spiralling cost of living. And the Prime Minister's response is never to take responsibility, show contrition, or even any level of basic understanding. He's so detached, he thinks he can paint a world in which their problems simply don't exist. The problem is he can't even fool his own MPs, let alone anyone else. The member for Mid Norfolk says he's exhausted. He's looking forward to new opportunities outside of Parliament. Why doesn't the Prime Minister do him a favour, call an election, so he and the whole country can move on?
Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you, Mr. Speaker. But whether it's Phil, whether it's everyone else across the country, the plan that we're putting in place is working to help people, and we're making progress. Just this week, taking action to stop children from vaping. Just this week, ensuring that people can visit their pharmacies to get the healthcare they need, freeing up millions of GP appointments. And just this week, millions of working people starting to see hundreds of pounds of tax cuts delivered in their pay packet, Mr. Speaker. That is a plan that is working. All he's offering is £28 billion of tax rises. And that is the choice, Mr. Speaker. It's a brighter future with us, or back to square one with them.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister likes to attend live sport, and so I wonder whether he would join me in welcoming the decision of the Planning Inspector in upholding Rugby Council's rejection of an application for development at Brandon Stadium in my constituency, to keep the doors open for it to remain a sporting venue, so that future generations will enjoy the thrills and spills of motorcycle speedway and stock cars.
Prime Minister.
Well, I join my honourable friend in paying tribute and being proud of actually Britain's rich history in the automotive and motorsport sectors, and the stadium that he talks about is a historic motorsport venue, and whilst it's been a shame to see it fall into disrepair, I hope that the decision he refers to enables a possibility of both speedway and stock car racing to return, and I know that my honourable friend will rightly continue to champion this cause.
SNP Leader Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, when the Tories scrapped the cap on bankers' bonuses in the autumn during a cost of living crisis, the Labour Party rightly opposed it. Yet here we are, just 3 months later, and the Labour Party support scrapping the cap on bankers' bonuses. Shameful. But is the Prime Minister comforted by the fact that he's now no longer alone in this House on being completely out of touch with public opinion?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said at the time, we supported the decision of the independent regulator because this was the right thing for financial stability. But that, Mr. Speaker, is because on this side of the House, we have a set of convictions and we have a plan and we stick to it. But he's absolutely right to point out the flip-flopping and U-turning and no convictions of the party opposite.
Of course, Mr. Speaker, scrapping the cap on bankers' bonuses was only made possible due to Brexit. So what the Westminster parties are now telling the public is that it's OK for bankers to have unlimited Brexit bonuses, but for the public sitting at home, struggling to feed their families, they have to suck up and deal with the additional food price cost as a result of Brexit red tape. That is the cost, and that is the reality of broken Brexit Britain. Isn't it the case that the great achievement of this Tory government is getting the Labour Party to agree to that bleak future?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're actually delivering benefits for people across Scotland, not just least in new free trade deals that are opening up markets for Scottish exporters, free ports that are attracting jobs and investment, the Brexit pubs guarantee, cutting the cost of a pint in Scottish pubs. But when he talks about the cost of living, Mr. Speaker, the thing that he could do most to help is make sure that Scotland isn't the highest tax part of the United Kingdom. And it's not just for high earners, Mr. Speaker. Everybody earning £28,500 or more is paying more tax in Scotland than they would in England, thanks to the SNP.
Ian Davison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One punch thrown, 2 days on life support, then 3 children left without a father. A 4-year sentence handed down, released after 2, but one grieving mother has to live a life sentence of agony. Sentencing for one-punch killers is not working in this country. Does the Prime Minister agree that now is the time to finally introduce a specific offence and a tougher minimum sentence for one-punch manslaughter?
Prime Minister.
I pay tribute to the work my honourable friend has done in bringing attention to so-called one-punch manslaughter and highlighting, as she knows well, the anguish those cases cause for the families of the victims. And I know the Ministry of Justice has looked very carefully at the amendment that my honourable friend has proposed, and I know that she'll be meeting the Minister for Safeguarding shortly to both discuss her specific amendment and how we might best address the wider issue.
Sir Ed David.
Speaker.
Order. Ed David.
My constituent Millie, a wheelchair user, had a serious accident at a sporting event. Millie was left waiting on the floor in pain for over 2 hours before an ambulance arrived. During her months in hospital since, she's been dropped badly multiple times, left stuck in her bed for days at length. She's even been told to soil herself when there's no one to take her to the toilet. Before all this, Millie was living independently and working, but the prospect of her returning to work is being destroyed by the crisis in the NHS and care system. I'm sure the Prime Minister will agree that no one should ever have to go through what Millie has, so will he look again at our proposals to make sure every patient gets the high-quality care they need?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very sorry to hear about Millie's case, and if there are specific aspects of it that need to be examined, I'm sure the Health Secretary will follow up with the honourable gentleman. And more generally, we want to make sure everyone gets the care they deserve, which is why we're not just investing record sums in the NHS, but ensuring that there are record numbers of doctors, nurses, and new innovative forms of treatment like surgical hubs and virtual wards, all of which is showing that ambulance times that he mentioned are lower today than they were this time last year.
Lynn Saxby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The #1 reason for children's hospital admissions in North Devon is for dental treatment. We have no NHS capacity and no orthodontist in Barnstable. Our dentists cannot recruit, even with large golden hellos. The emergency dental plan does seem to have been stuck at the Treasury forever. My right honourable friend uses spare set of keys and pop round and rescue it for us, please. My constituents and I would be ever so grateful.
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend has rightly championed the provision of dentistry in her local area. We're investing £3 billion a year, and the reformed contracts in dentistry from the NHS have improved access while ensuring fairer remuneration for dentists, and we're also providing more financial support for those who need it the most. So around half of the course of treatment last year were delivered to those who are non-paying, both adults and children. But yes, more needs to be done, and that's why our dentistry recovery plan will be published shortly.
Andrew Bridgen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. More than 2 decades ago, the then Prime Minister Tony Blair misled this House by promoting and endorsing the Post Office Horizon IT system as perfect, protecting the large corporation that created it and causing untold harm and damage and misery to innocent people. Can the current Prime Minister think of anything he has promoted in partnership with huge businesses as safe and effective, which has ultimately harmed the British people? And will he use this opportunity to correct that safe and effective statement, or will he choose the same line as Tony Blair, sit back, do nothing, and let the misery just continue to pile up?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as we've been clear, the Horizon scandal is a terrible miscarriage of justice, and we're doing everything that we can to make it right. To what he was more broadly insinuating, let me be unequivocal from this dispatch box that COVID vaccines are safe, Mr. Speaker.
Jill Gideon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The shocking revelations of the Horizon scandal highlighted the Post Office's financial incompetence, and my right honourable friend will know that the public's confidence in the institution is at an all-time low. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that, as high street banks are closing branches across the country, we should look to developing new community banking solutions rather than giving the Post Office sole responsibility for providing access to cash and other banking services in poorly served neighbourhoods?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for a question, but I also just say that we shouldn't mistake conflating this scandal with the actions of many hard-working local postmasters and sub-postmasters, because customers can access cash and banking services through a wide range of channels, including a contract with the Post Office counter service, which does provide a valuable channel. And that I agree with her, though, the importance of access to cash, which is why the government has legislated to protect that as part of the recent Financial Services and Markets Act, and ensures that the vast majority of people should be no more than 3 miles away from such a cash point.
John Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the Nolan principles, integrity, states that holders of public office should not act to gain material benefits for themselves, their family or their friends. Prime Minister, on the 6th of January, you tweeted a link to the Conservative Party website which seemed to scrape people's data and place unwanted cookies on their machines. The Good Law Project is now pursuing. Can the Prime Minister assure the House that no laws have been broken by his party?
Yes. Mr. Speaker, of course our party follows all laws.
Robert Jenrick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a first responsibility for government is to fix the housing crisis that young people didn't cause. 3 years ago, we dragged house building in this country up to the highest level since 1987, after the last Labour government left it at its lowest level since the 1920s. But house building is weakening. We need to do more. Will my right honourable friend consider using the budget to do as he and I did together during the pandemic and cut stamp duty to boost housing starts, to reignite the economy and to support thousands of businesses across our country?
Prime Minister.
Well, my right honourable friend is right to point out that since 2010 we have delivered 2.5 million additional homes, on track to deliver 1 million just in this Parliament, and help over 850,000 families into home ownership through schemes such as Help to Buy and Right to Buy. Obviously, tax decisions are a matter for the Chancellor, but I would point out that our existing stamp duty relief for first-time buyers ensures the vast majority of first-time buyers in our country pay absolutely no stamp duty.
Marcia de Cordova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The APPG on eye health and visual impairment has today published polling that found that nearly half of employers exclude blind and partially sighted people from their workplaces, and 1 in 4 said that they would not be willing to make workplace adjustments. The disability employment gap remains stubbornly at 30%, and the pay gap means that blind and partially sighted people effectively work for free for 47 days of the year. So will the Prime Minister meet with me and sight loss organisations to discuss how we can create a more inclusive workforce?
Prime Minister.
Well, I share the honourable lady's ambition to have an inclusive workforce, and the record in supporting those with disabilities into work over the past several years has been incredibly strong. I know this is something that the Work and Pension Secretary is actively looking at and making sure that our accessibility plan is up to date and inclusive, and I'll ensure that she gets a meeting with the relevant minister.
Sir Michael Ellis.
Mr. Speaker, having visited recently, I know that Israel remains in shock following the rape, murder and butchery of Hamas. All of us want to see a peaceful and demilitarised Palestinian state. However, Hamas remain in control in large parts of Gaza. Their support is growing in the West Bank. Nearly 2/3 of Palestinians in polling reject coexistence with Israel, and the Palestinian Authority has continued to promote hatred of Jews. Does my right honourable friend agree that any recognition of a Palestinian state must address these issues and can only come about as part of a negotiated settlement between Israel and the Palestinians?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government's position is clear. My honourable friend is right that there are steps and conditions that need to be put in place on this journey. First and foremost, the removal of Hamas from Gaza, a Palestinian-led government in Gaza and the West Bank, a concrete plan to reform and support the Palestinian Authority, a reconstruction plan for Gaza, and a two-state solution, which we have long supported. So let me be clear, we stand with Israel, and the terrorist threat that they face must be limited, and Israel's lasting security must be guaranteed.
Mr. Speaker, on the 15th of November last year, I appealed to the Prime Minister to choose de-escalation and peace over violence, death and destruction. He called me naive. So far, over 26,000 souls have perished in Gaza. Shameful. In a powerful and moving open letter in Monday's New York Times, the Jewish Voice for Peace Rabbinical Council cited Deuteronomy. I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life, accusing President Biden of choosing death. If the Prime Minister won't listen to me or the ICJ, will he listen to the Rabbinical Council, or will he call them naive too?
Yeah. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've been clear multiple times that we are concerned, deeply concerned, about the impact of the fighting in Gaza on the civilian population. Too many people have lost their lives, and there is a desperate need for increased humanitarian support in Gaza. I won't go over all the debates we've had about the conditions that are necessary for an immediate pause leading to a sustainable ceasefire, but I can assure the House that we are doing everything that we can to get more aid into the region as quickly as possible.
Kelly Tolhurst.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Chatham Docks supports over 800 local high-value jobs which are at risk as the owners are continuing in their pursuit to displace successful businesses such as ArcelorMittal Kent Wire. The Labour Council are failing to honour the commitment they made before the local elections to protect the docks and the jobs. Even their leader, the Right Honourable Member for Holborn and St Pancras, said he was proudly backing Save Chatham Docks campaign. Will my Right Honourable friend meet with me to see how we can protect the docks and save those jobs for my constituents? And isn't this just another example of how Labour and their leaders change their position depending on which way the wind blows?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend has been a constant champion of Chatham Docks, and I am disappointed to hear that the local Labour Council are failing to honour the commitments that they've made. But also, as she points out, I'm not surprised to see that the Leader of the Opposition has said one thing and then consequently done another. The docks support hundreds of jobs, and I join with her in calling on the Council to rethink their approach.
That completes Prime Minister's questions. We now come to the statements. Minister Ledson.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I would like to make a statement on the launch of our Pharmacy First service. Pharmacies are at the centre of our communities, an accessible front door to our NHS for millions of people.